Hi there and welcome to another video. This video is part 2 of a tutorial about how we can build Bifrost USD stages and layers for those stages, and then how we can add data types to that stage and save all that out as USD data. In the first video, we created a USD stage and also a simple sub-layer structure. And now in this video, we're basically going to continue with that concept and explore how we can add data types to any one of our stage layers and then save all that data out as USD files. So we have our layers in our graph and we can see them here in the layer editor, and we're now ready to try and add some data to this stage and also onto a particular layer, because remember, whenever we add anything into a USD stage, it has to be saved to a particular layer. So not only do we want to introduce the concept of adding data to our stage, we also want to have the ability of being able to specify which layer we want to add any data to. And it's at this point where the add to stage node really becomes relevant, because this is what we're going to use in order to add any data to our stage. So I'm going to tab into my Bifrost menu. I'm going to navigate through to my USD category here, and then the stage subcategory. And again, it's the first one on the list, add to stage. And again, just by looking through the list, looking at the names of the nodes, we can quickly determine and make a pretty good guesstimate that this node is going to do exactly what we are actually looking for. So I'm just going to click this into my graph. Now, where do we actually add it into our graph? Well, again, it's following the basic Bifrost principles. We're doing the creation of stage up here, and all our layers are being directed into our stage. And then we're directing that data from the output here into this instruction of saving the data out to disk. So we want to interrupt this flow of data here, just like we would do with any other Bifrost graph. And if we look in the actual node itself into the info panel, there's a number of things to look at here. So the input on the stage, this input port here, is saying that this is the stage that you want to add data to. So this is our stage up here. So we take this and plug it into the add node. So we're telling this add node that this stage here, Z stage 01, this is the stage that we want to add data to. And then the output of that addition, you might say, is what will be pumped out of this output stage here. So then this has to then be directed somewhere in order for that instruction to be executed. Now, we could just plug it directly into this output node here, which would still work. However, if we do this, we're not going to be able to save anything out because we're bypassing this save stage node here. So anything we do here won't be actually saved out with our stage and layer data. So we have to then take the output of this add to stage and plug it into the save stage node. So we've now interrupted this flow of data with this add node, and now we can start thinking about what it is we need to add and where to add it. So with the add to stage node in place, we now need to think about which layer we want to target or specify, and then we can add some data to that particular layer. But then how do we do this? Usually we would go to the USD Layer editor and simply choose the actual layer like so. But if I do this here, Bifrost has no awareness of that. So this isn't going to work. Instead, we actually have to specify in the Bifrost graph in order for any data to be actually added. And we do this using what's called a layer index. And this is actually a parameter which is set here as part of the add to stage node. Now at the moment it's set to -1, and that's the default. So every time you add this stage to your graph, it will always be set to -1 by default. But what does that actually mean? Well, this is explained in the info panel, and the info panel is always a good starting point. You've probably noticed already that I go to the info panel quite a lot, because here there's lots of information and each node should be documented, and it'll tell you exactly what it is it's trying to do and also what the inputs and outputs actually are. But if we look down the list here, there's a comment about layer index. And this is the index of the layer to which prim definitions are to be added. So in other words, we specify a certain index to denote which layer we want to actually add something to. But how do you know which layer is which particular number? Well, it does actually say this because it says the default of -1 refers to the root layer. So our root layer here is the one at the very top of the stack, the Z Stage 01, which is the same name as our stage. It also says that sublayers are indexed consecutively, with 0 being at the bottom of the stack and each successive layer above the previous. So that means that sequence.usda, which is at the bottom of our stack, will be layer index 0, and then each one above it will increase consecutively. So we can actually try this out. So we go to our parameters, and if I was to just go into the layer index and put in 0, note in our USD layer editor, when I just hit enter, the highlight has now gone down to the bottom layer. So if I increase this to say 1, it's now moved to sequence dressing, 2 will be sequence layout, and 3 will be sequence effect. So that's how we specify where we need stuff to actually go. So I'm actually going to set this to 1, which is sequence dressing, because this is the layer that I want to target and now add something to. So with the layer index set, we can now start looking at adding something to our particular layer. But then how do we do this? Well, again, this is where the prim definitions come into play on our input here. But again, we don't quite know what it is we need to add or what node to connect up. It says here that this will be a list of Bifrost USD prim definitions to add. But again, just like with any other Bifrost port, you could right click on this, move down to create node, and it will give you a list of the nodes that can be plugged into this particular input. Now, this is where things can get a little bit complex and where you're probably going to need some kind of basic knowledge of USD, because there's going to be some very specific USD terms here that you might not understand. And you can see here there's 5 nodes that we can plug into this particular input. We've got USD Prim, USD Mesh, Curves, USD Preview Surface, or USD Point Instancer. I'm not going to go through each one of these definitions right now, but the first thing we're probably going to start with is a simple USD Prim, because that's probably the most common node that you're going to recognize. So I'm just going to choose this, and again it will add the node and automatically connect it up. And with that, you'll notice then in that info panel there's a long list of information to go through, and I'm not going to go through all of this either, but I would advise that you take your time and go through this slowly so you understand exactly what's going on. Now, upon adding this particular node, it's also worth looking at your outliner now, because we should now start to have the basics of a stage framework and hierarchy as well. So if we go to the Maya USD proxy node, you need to make sure you've got shapes turned on as well in the outliner. And if we begin to expand this out, we can now see we actually have a node here called OBJ, which refers to this node here that we've just added to our stage. So at this point, if I was to go to my save stage node, toggle on the enable so that we're saving data out. So if we go to my text editor, where I've loaded up the sequence dressing.usda file, you'll see that we've now got the starting point of some data that's being added to this particular sublayer of our stage. And you can see here it's defined as next form OBJ. So OBJ is the name of that, and we can see this when we look at the node itself here. But I can change this to basically anything I want. So if I just change this to say Geo, for example, that will update. Now, looking down the sections here on terms of some of the general terms, again, there's a lot to go through here. So I'm just going to cover some basic primitive concepts. Now, the type of prim that's been defined here is an X form. So an X form is basically like a transform node, or essentially like a parent or group node in Maya. And again, this is actually Xform is actually a specific USD definition, and we can see this in the info panel. When we just move down to general under type, it says this is the type of USD Prim such as scope, Xform, capsule, cone, cube, cylinder, sphere, mesh, and NURBS curve. So these are actually specific USD definitions, and we can also see these as well if we go to our outliner and just say we click on a node here, and if we right mouse click, and then there's a section here that says add new prim, and you can see that these are also defined here as well. So we have a def, scope, Xform, and then also these primitive shapes. But don't add them here under the outliner because it won't actually work. Remember, we're doing everything from within the Bifrost graph. If you add it here in the outliner, Bifrost will have no concept of it. It will have no knowledge or visibility of it because nothing's been imported into our graph itself. It's like anything in Bifrost. If you do particles or definitions on objects in your scene, you have to import those objects into your graph so that Bifrost becomes aware of them. Now, as I mentioned, these types are specific USD definitions. So if I was to copy any one of these names, like capsule, and paste it into the type of into my parameter, then it will change that particular type of USD Prim. So at the moment we got to Xform, I've just copied the term capsule. So now if I was to paste this into here and now just hit enter, we zoom into our viewport, we'll notice it's now added a capsule. So this is a simple USD primitive. And now after performing a save, if I go to my text editor, we can see that the type has also changed, so that we've now got a capsule, and that capsule is called Geo. So I can now start adding more stuff to this particular definition now, or this prim. And again, all of these things that are added here as inputs are what I can actually add. And again, without going through each one individually, I can right click on any one of these and it will give me an idea of what I can add. So this is where I can add a variance set. I can add reference definitions as well. But the one I really want is attribute definitions. And this is very useful because this is where I can start adding parameters in order to transform this particular prim. So if I right click this, move down to create node, I can now add a USD transform. And this is basically giving me specifics of simple X, Y, Z values. So again, if I was to just take any value here in the X and type in 1, my capsule will now move. And again, it's important to do this here from the graph. Don't actually select it, because see, I can select it in the viewport, and I can even move it if I want to. But if I do this, again, it's performing a transform on it, and it will be completely lost because it needs to be defined here in the graph. The graph will always override anything that I try and do in the viewport. Now at this point, I can continue to add other attributes. So if I right click this, I might want to add it as a color so I can differentiate it from any other types of data that I wish to add. So I'm just going to choose this one, and the default is set to blue, but this is simple RGB colors. So just put a value in any one of these or use the slider, and you can see I can begin to change the colors of my prim. And I can keep adding more things to this particular layer as well. So again, I can right click up here, choose another USD prim, and again, that will add another object to our hierarchy, and say I'll call this, if I go to my info panel, I'll pick out one of the specifics here. I'll make it a cylinder, copy that, and paste it into there. And now I'll also just give this a name and just call it SYL, CYL. And now if I perform a simple save, toggle that on and off, go to my text editor, and we can see more information is being populated in our USD file. So of course you got the capsule here, Geo. We've got the actual color values being specified, and you can see here we've got float 3 values. Float 3 meaning 3 values for each for X, Y, and Z. So again, you see we've got the rotate, scale, and translate. So you can begin to see now how you can start to populate your layers and how the structure of the actual USD file is taking place. Now we've got a very flat hierarchy here, but let's say, for example, that I'll add a transform to this as well. And let's just say I just move it off to one side. Now I can move each one of these prims individually, but there's a very flat hierarchy. Let's say I want these to be part of an actual group, or maybe I want to have a parent node above it. Well, I can do that really. I can simply unplug any one of these and create a new prim definition. So I'm just going to do a little bit of tidying up now. So firstly, with this geo, I'm going to rename this and call it cap. And now I'm actually going to unplug these prims. Now I'm going to define a new prim definition here. And I'll just call this geo group. But I'm going to keep this as an X form. Now, in order to actually add anything underneath this, this is where the children come in, this children input here. Because if I right click this, I get the same 5 options I had to first define a prim. So of course, I've got prim, mesh, curves, point instancer, and USD preview surface. So again, I could just simply create a new USD prim. And again, if I look in my outliner, I've got a basics of a hierarchy. But of course, I don't need this one. I've already got them defined here. So I'm actually going to just delete that. And this time, just plug in my capsule there, and then plug in my cylinder there. And we've now got them added under this hierarchy. So again, if I was to just perform a simple save, and now go to my text editor and look at that layer file, we can see now the structure beginning to take more shape. So there's our X-form geo group, and we've got the capsule and the cylinder contained within that group. Now, I've added some very simple USD prims here of some very specific USD types, which are actually defined in the USD schema. But of course, if you go to your outliner, and as I mentioned before, if you right click, there's an option to add prims here. But if you go to the actual bottom of the list here, which says all registered, you can see there's a subheading and menu where it defines all the extra and additional USD types that you can specify. So as you can see, there's quite a lot once you begin to look into the submenus like Arnold and also the physics. Now, we've just been targeting the sequence dressing layer. So what do we do now if we want to add stuff to another layer? Because at the moment, everything's going into this single add stage node. And we've set a layer index of 1. But if we change this, it will then reassign these prims to that particular layer. So how do we add another one? Well, it's really very simple, and we just introduce another add to stage node. And again, we essentially create a daisy chain of these nodes where we keep adding stuff to it. So again, with this one, I could just maybe plug this into there like so, and then take this and plug it into there. But of course, that only gives me one input. If I do this, it knocks out this one here. So that's not really going to work. So I can only have one output stage going into this save stage node. So what do we do here? Well, let's just redirect this out stage there and get our prims back. So what we do here instead is we take the out stage from this add node and direct it into this additional add node as well. So again, let's take that. Actually, let's unplug it from there and plug it into here. And then from there, we'll plug it into the save. So essentially what we're doing, we're creating a flow of data through the graph, but we're creating a chain of add to stage nodes, each one being a particular different layer. So this one will choose, say, layer index 2, which will be our sequence layout here, which you can see now has become activated. Now, one thing you have to realize with these layers and the add to stage nodes is that they don't change when they're selected. So you actually have to go into the layer index and or the parameters to see which particular layer is being targeted. Because at the moment I've got number 2 specified using this node, but when I click on this node, it says 1, but the actual icon doesn't change. So that might be just a little bit confusing. But of course, you can just double click the node here at the stage and just put in, say, layer 1, and it will change the name. So therefore, you can begin to see what's actually being targeted here. Again, that's entirely down to you if you want to do that. You could always just remove the name and keep the add to stage, because bear in mind it does get appended with each node that you actually add, and use a backdrop instead and group all these nodes together in a backdrop like I've done here with the layers. I mean, it's up to you how you want to do it really. So with this new add to stage node added, now we've set the layer index to 2, we can now go ahead and specify our prims. So I'm going to start with a define USD Prim. I'm going to keep it as an X form, but this time I'm going to call it a different name, and I'll call it USD Mesh, because I want to add a specific type of data to this particular USD layer. So again, go to my children, right click, create node, USD Prim. Actually, no, I don't want to add that. Yeah, I wanted to add the USD Mesh instead. Find USD Mesh. Now here I can direct a mesh into this input here. And again, we look in the info panel, it tells us exactly what it will do. So again, it's meshes connect a Bifrost mesh object. So again, and I can refer to the other Bifrost nodes, not just USD nodes here. So if I tab into my menu, if I put in, say, mesh, we can create a mesh cube. This is a Bifrost cube. Plug this in, and I've now got a cube being defined. And I've also got some dimensions and transform values here that I can actually specify. And just as before, I can keep adding as many children as I want. So again, I can keep adding. Now notice here, when I've just added that extra node, I've got one here called mesh. And as soon as I added this node, my cube has disappeared. And the reason for it is because they're both, the path name is exactly the same. And the new one will immediately overwrite the old one. So what I have to do now is define a new name for it. So if I go back to my original one and just call this cube, it will now come back and it makes this new mesh completely unique. So again, I can call this something new and just call it sphere. And now from here, I can tab in mesh and say we want a sphere and plug that into there. And now we've got more nodes being added. I go to my save stage, toggle that on and off. I go to my text editor, and now I want to load up sequence layout.usda. So now with that loaded, we can see here the data looks very different, because now we're dealing with proper mesh data. So of course we've got point values, which is what all this data array is referring to. So you can see here, there's my Xform group node called USD Mesh. First one is called cube. And there's all the point normals and the point data for it. And then, of course, then we've got the sphere. Now, of course, I've got 2 different types of data under each one of these group nodes. But I can actually add now a separate transform node to each one of these. So that basically means I can not only transform them individually, but I can transform them as a group. So, again, there's my mesh cube. I can transform this individually, but then I can take the entire group like so and move my sphere and my cube together. And so the last thing to look at is we can add USD data into our graph, but then what if we've got actual geometry that's part of our scene? So again, I'm going to my create menu, and I'm just going to choose something simple like this default soccer ball. Now, I said I wasn't going to use anything from the Maya menus, but all I'm doing now is I'm adding some mesh data to my scene. I'm not actually using any of the modify or manipulation or the marking menus for this particular mesh. I've just added a mesh to my scene. Now, I could have imported this from an FBX file or an OBJ file or whatever, really. I just need some mesh data in my scene. And so again, I can simply drag this and import it into my graph like I would do with any other type of data. So there's my mesh, middle mouse click and drag it into my graph. So there's the shape node being added, and it's a mesh. So now all I need to do is bring in a new USD Prim X form. So again, let's bring this in. Actually, no, I want it as a child, so I'll bring this down here. There's a Prim, and we'll call this ball, and then attribute is a no, so I've done that wrong. I don't want a Prim, I want a USD Mesh. It's already there, so that's that. Then up here I call it a ball, and then under the mesh I just take the output here and I plug it into here, and straight away if we look in our hierarchy, we can now begin to see we've got the ball, and you'll now notice that it's moved because it's inheriting the transform that I've added up here. And just like you would do with any other Bifrost object that you've imported from your scene, remember, don't delete this object here because this is the source object. What you're seeing here in the graph is a representation of that object which Bifrost is executing. So you can hide it like so, but don't delete it. I'm actually going to just add a transform node on my sphere so I can actually move it out of the way. There we go. There we go. So now this looks quite complex, but that's because I haven't done any organizing. So really what I should do at this point is start to group these together, maybe using a backdrop so it's a bit more clearer. But these nodes here all denote everything on layer 2, which is sequence layout. And then these nodes here all refer to everything we've got on layer 1, which is sequence dressing. And I'm going to do one final last save. So that now if we go back to my text editor, we've now got even more data starting to be populated. And there's our ball, and we've got even more point data. So to summarize, and this just go over things one last time, we created a USD stage here with this node, and then we've plugged in these 4 sub layers to this stage. And then we initially said to Bifrost, this is our stage, and we want that saved, that stage be saved with this node here. So again, let's just recreate that for a second. There we go. So this is what we started with. Our stage made up of these 4 sub layers. We then took that data and directed it into this save stage node, and then we can control where and when our USD data will be saved out. And then what we did, we introduced an add node. So what we did here is we said this stage data that's being directed from the creation, we're going to interrupt that stage data and we're going to add some data to it. So we take in our stage that we want to add data to, and we add it into the add stage node, and then the output of that addition is then driven into our save stage node because we want it to be saved out with our stage. And then using the add to stage node, we targeted the sequence dressing layer by setting a specific layer index to represent this particular layer. And then we've added various USD prims to this layer to denote a cylinder, a cylinder here and a capsule. And then we've added some simple USD transforms and attributes so we can recognize these particular shapes. Then to add more data to another stage, we introduced another add to stage node here, this time set to a layer index of 2, which meant it was our sequence layout layer. So again, rather than trying to plug it into the save stage directly, we had to daisy chain it onto after this particular stage. So then we took this output and we plugged it into there, and then the output of this addition then goes into our save stage. So we're taking the creation of the stage, we're adding something here, and then we're adding something again on top of that, and then the output of all these are being directed into our save stage, which is then being executed by Bifrost. And then for this particular add to stage nodes, which is layer index 2, which is our sequence layout, we've added a Bifrost mesh and actually a USD mesh and a Bifrost mesh cube here and a sphere, and then we've then imported actual geometry created from Maya, in this case a soccer ball, and we've also imported it into our graph here. And then finally, when we saved everything out, we can see everything in our text editor for our particular layer. So this is the sequence layout.usd ASCII file, and you can see there's our group node, the USD mesh, there's the cube, there's the rotate, scale and translate values for this group node, there's the cube, there's the sphere, and it's got point data because it's actually a mesh, and also there's our ball, and that's got even more point data as well because this again is a mesh. So there we go. So that's a very simple and crude example of how to create a stage in Bifrost USD, how to add layers to that stage, and then how to add some very simple data types or USD data types to that stage with also some very specific USD attributes. So at this point, we've reached a natural conclusion to the end of this video. We've been able to create a stage, add sublayers to that stage, following the Pixar USD example here. We've then used Bifrost to target specific layers and then add specific USD prims and attributes to any one of those particular layers. But all along, we've been saving out this data as separate USD files to represent the stage itself, and then files to represent each one of our specific sub layers. Now, because that data has been saved out as USD files, we can now go to another application which also supports USD and load up this stage in exactly the same way. So if I crudely go to another instance of Maya that I've got open here, but this time I'm not going to use Bifrost to open the stage, I'm going to use the USD for Maya workflow. So that means going to the create menu here, going down to universal scene description, and I'm going to create a stage from a file. And I'm just going to choose my zstage.usda file. And when I do this, it will load up the layers and also the data that I've got contained on those layers, which is what we can actually see here. We go to the outliner, we can expand out the hierarchy, and we can see everything is grouped in exactly the same way that we authored it in Bifrost. And even if we go to our USD layer editor, we can see our sub layers here all listed accordingly, all in the right ordering as well. Now at this point, we can still continue to manipulate this data. So I can still select any one of these objects and do something to it. But I've got to be very careful now about what I do on a particular layer. But what I guess would be the best practice here would be not to actually do anything on these particular layers, but instead add a whole new layer and target anything on that. So of course, if I wanted to, I could say, well, take this sphere and move it over there, that box, sorry, and then that would be recorded on this particular layer, and then I can save this layer out to disk as well. And this is the whole point of USD, or actually one of the points about it and one of the benefits is that it enables people from different teams and disciplines to work on the same stage and use layers to create overrides or manipulations to the same data. So they're not necessarily destroying one thing over another. So again, I could take this anonymous layer, rename it, export it out as a USD file, and then even load it into this particular Bifrost graph. So that's it. We've now reached the end of the video. I hope you found this very useful, and I hope you've been able to follow along with me. This stuff can get very complex, so I always try and aim to explain things in a very simple, clear and concise way so that even the beginner can follow along with me. Feel free to like the video, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll try my best to answer them. In the meantime, stay tuned to the channel. Please subscribe, because I'm hoping to get more Bifrost videos and more Bifrost USD videos in particular uploaded there very, very soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.